and that they do a lot of patronizing with regards to race, that you see specifically in Evergreen, that the Black student is living in a very dangerous world, is very fragile, and so needs all these extra resources and all this extra attention and all these eggshells we're going to scatter around the entire campus so that you don't upset this person that can barely even go to college, barely even step out their door without being shot, which is rhetoric that's actually pushed out by faculty at Evergreen. So with regards to college, broadly speaking, there's a lot of different aspects or kind of factors that are creating this situation where now, I can't remember what college, I should be better with facts and names and stuff, but just this past fall, even though it was COVID time and everybody was remote, the students staged this grand protest over something. I can't remember. Wow. Bryn Mawr, I think it was. They staged this grand protest and they shut down classes for 2 weeks. And it was all about this racist incident. It was like an email or somebody drew a poop swastika on the wall. It happens over and over and over again, where this one little incident that could be interpreted as racist is then used as proof that the entire institution needs to be shut down so that we can demand a non-racist safe space.
Hello, everybody. You're listening to Chatting with Candice. I'm your host, Candice Warback. Before we get started on this week's episode, if you want to support the podcast, you can go to chattingwithcandice.com. From there, you can either sign up for our Patreon account where you get early access to episodes and the occasional bonus content, or you can click that little link that says Buy Me Coffee. Both things help me out a ton. Another simple way to support the podcast is simply by leaving a 5-star review and a comment or sharing it with a buddy. So that's all I have to plug today. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Help me welcome Benjamin Boyce. So I was looking at a bunch of your videos this weekend, and it's funny because you know how sometimes you never know how you get introduced to somebody? Like you just start following them and you can't really recall how that happened and they followed you and you don't really know when that transaction happened. So I don't know how I was introduced to you, but I had no idea of your origin story. Like, remember when we were talking, I'm like, are you in New Zealand? And you're like, you have no idea where I came from. So I was watching the series. I'm not that far into it. I actually had to stop because I got a lot of anxiety. I was like, I can't believe this is real life, or this was real life. So for the listeners, I would love, I mean, as detailed as you want to be or not be, or as brief as you want to be, but just kind of your experience at the Evergreen College. Like I said, you have an amazing series that I encourage people to check out if they want like a full, to fully immerse themselves into it. But were you there for that? Were you in any of those rooms? Okay.
Yeah, a lot of the rooms I wasn't in. So what happened was that in the spring of 2017, the Evergreen State College underwent a wild week of protest having to do with accusations that the institution was irredeemably racist and white supremacist and a bedrock of all the evils of Western society. And the students in this state of high agitation went to a number of different authority figures and protested them and live streamed all of that onto the internet. And they took over the campus. There was blockading. There was hostage taking, maybe a mild form of hostage taking, but definitely people were blockaded into rooms and not allowed to leave or even to urinate without oversight of the students, including the president of the college.
That's terrifying.
And yeah, it was really, really ridiculous during that time. So I was on campus for the second day of protest. The first day of protest, which most people probably know of because it involved a public figure that was able to pinpoint the problems that were going on and articulate them in a very fine manner, named Brett Weinstein. He was the first person that they protested. And the reasons why they protested him are because of some emails that he wrote protesting politely, or at least, he said he's protesting this thing called the Day of Absence, where traditionally Black students, faculty, and staff absented themselves from the campus and did workshops off campus, and then so-called white people did workshops on campus about being white or being of color, and then they would come back on the next day and have a day of presence where everybody's supposed to celebrate diversity and all of its wondrous flowerings of multiculturalism. And but what happened in the wake of the Trump election, and also in the wake of much studied redesigning, or at least proposals of redesigning the school around concepts of diversity, inclusion, and equity, especially this word named equity that everybody had a different definition of. Mm. It had something to do with equal outcomes. And they were doing a lot of proposals about, recreating a college that was much more fair, I think would be a more grounded term, for everybody, especially students of color, and especially Black students, and especially, I guess, Native American and Pacific Islander students. But mostly it was about the Black students. And the proposals that they made regarding that were based on data that was, and I have recordings of this, from the head of statistics. The data that they used to show that Evergreen was racist was fallacious. They cherry-picked the data to show what they wanted. The actual outcomes include, the negative outcomes actually include a lot of low-income, first-generation white male students, and they scrubbed that out because the white male, as was evinced in seminar, workshop, lecture, and class that I took over the course of my 4.5 years there, the white male was, the dominant force and the vector of oppression. But even though the white male is not being served by this institution, especially the low income white male, that was kind of hushed up to boost up this particular group. They wanted to reorganize resources to attend to. So Brett Weinstein was involved along with other teachers in arguing against this, and he's a very progressive man. So he states time and again that he's for equity. I don't know exactly what he means by equity, and I don't want to put words into his mouth, but he definitely thought of a different version of equity, or at least he was thinking about the outcomes, the real outcomes of these initiatives. And when the college decided to reverse the day of absence and invite and actually require students to segregate based on race, and white students to go and participate in these off-campus seminars, and the content of these seminars for white people was about their privilege and about their complicity in the oppression of everybody else, and owning up to that. So it was incredibly dogmatic, as we can see in other aspects of our society now. So the students decided to protest Brett Weinstein first, and they filmed that all, and Brett had connections in social media land, and the way that the students protested was over the top. You can see that you really have to see how they're acting. It is crazy making and anxiety making, and it might be bad for your blood pressure, but it might inoculate you to any struggle sessions that you might stumble into in your day-to-day life. But they protested Brett Weinstein. Then the cops were called because somebody said that they have professors being trapped. So the cops responded to check that out, and the students rushed the cops. The cops moved the students out of the way, and therefore that was their claim to police violence. The cops kind of just kind of let the students go, and then the students went, and they're like, well, what do we do next? It's all on video. What do we do next? Well, let's go to let's carry on. Let's keep this going. So they go to the admin building, the library admin building, and they just continue just going crazier and crazier and crazier and crazier, and all live stream. So there were rooms that I was in that I was witnessing this. Towards the end of the documentary, which is a very long documentary, there's a room that I'm actually in, a class that I'm in, where a struggle session happens, where white people are told to shut the F up. We're told that our silence is literally killing the students of color. And then when we ask for clarification, we're told to shut the F up. So we're like, well, what do you want? What do you want? And they just kind of want to tear us down and do the struggle session thing where they browbeat people. It's all on tape. It's all on tape. So at first it seemed really ridiculous because Evergreen's Evergreen's activist tendencies are always kind of silly to me. Sorry to say, but all these posters and these slogans, and like they had this one, the epitome of Evergreen. They had this free the nipple protest. And I don't even think that there's laws in Washington about the female breast
No, I
being
think you can be kind of
occluded.
naked. Yeah.
Yeah, but they still wanted to protest that. So they all stood there and took off their shirts. And, all these 22-year-old girls, topless, and which is something. And then and so they get all that attention, and then they use that attention to berate males and say, "Men, you're sexualizing us, and it's disgusting how you look at us." And you're like, okay, like there's one side of the story, and I'm not going to say anything, but those are some very ripe bosoms that you have on display. And I'm sorry, you're displaying them to get attention in order
Right.
to do what with that attention. So,
Right.
it just kind of let that level of, young people experimenting with being serious, experimenting with have a lot of meaning in their life and changing the world. And there's a lot of rhetoric about changing the world at Evergreen. And when the new president came on in 2015, he explicitly made the college's activist wing, he put them in power specifically around issues of race. And all these workshops started happening. I have all the footage. I was on camera in those. I was in those rooms. And those rooms were very ritualized. It was just like being in a church, but a very, very boring, sanctimonious church. Like it was all about oppression and solving oppression, and everybody had like these witness statements, and then they had these drum circles, and they had all these sermons and stuff, and then they'd show you the data, and the data, like you could obviously see that Evergreen's doing really, really good with regards to students of color. Like they're increasing ahead of the national average, and they're having a better reportage about the happiness of these students. But they're like, as you can see, you're looking at the data. As you can see, the dominant culture is in the way, and we need to, now is the time to really change ourselves and stuff like that. So there was a culture within the faculty and the staff that was supported and promoted by the president, by the very top, of making everything about race, about implementing all of these workshops and seminars. Robin DiAngelo, white fragility woman, she was brought on campus, and she gave like 2 or 3 very long explanations about how white people need to shut up and listen to her because they're white, blah 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 blah. And there was never argument about that. Whenever argument came up, it was very quickly squashed. It was squashed within the faculty, and I have all the emails where they would dogpile on anybody that questioned their axiomatic principle that Evergreen was a racist place filled with white supremacy, even though was the most progressive place, at least in Washington, which is a very progressive place already. So the culture was already there at the faculty level, and it broke out at the student level. And what you see in the protest, and I'll wrap it up and we can go on from here, was that the actual power structure, the authority of the president was completely non-existent because they were doing everything that he and all of the college taught them to do. And they were not equipped to put a lid on this or to even help them articulate themselves better. And so all that footage went out on the internet, and Brett Weinstein went out on the internet and spoke about it too. And then I eventually said, okay, listen, internet, this isn't just about a bunch of crazy young people. Young people are crazy. This is about the ideas that were put into the young people's head that enabled them to act crazy and disabled the administration from actually controlling that, but rather only conceding to it, up to and including allowing them to tell him and then escort him to the potty. So.
See, and so for me, I'm just so curious, I guess, to the environment that led the students to have, I guess, the confidence and the power to do these things. Because like I said, when I was watching those videos, I kind of had to stop a couple times because I felt so anxious. I've been to university, and in no way would that have flown where I went to school. It just wouldn't have it would have been shut down within, probably 20 minutes. And this went on for a week. And then a lot of people have the idea of saying, well, it's just college kids and that's what they do. They're trying to find themselves and find a purpose. And, college kids always have been activists and protesters. Like that's just part of that experience for those years. But you're seeing this bleed out into society now, into big business and into government and into regulations and media. You can't kind of turn your head without bumping into it. And I think it's really important for people like you that have this platform and you're having these difficult conversations and bringing awareness to these topics that a lot of people are like, this doesn't affect my day to day, so I don't have time to pay it any mind. And I was one of those people. I haven't been in a couple of years because I'm like, I see it. And my husband's like, you need to calm down. This is stressing you out. What are you going to do about it anyways? But we see these effects with raising our child and, trying to figure out what school he's going to go to and what's it going to be like for him to grow up. So I guess where I'm going with that is, how did we kind of create this new normal? Because it kind of is, right? Like you see the Coca-Cola thing that went viral, like a month ago, where it was like,
where white people need to apologize. Yeah, be less white.
You can't say that to any other group, like be less gay, be less Asian, be less Black. You can't say that. So it shouldn't be okay in the reverse, right? And then where are we going wrong? Like how do we correct course? I know it's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's really, really big. I mean, that's why I have hours and hours and hours of conversations with now hundreds of people, like talking through this and talking about like different tiny little aspects of it.
Right.
Big thing is education. Big thing is you could probably look at the economics of this. You can look at kind of a theory of the managerial elite and how the people who really kind of control and steer our government and America at large are a class of unelected citizens that have all been programmed through universities. They all have university degrees. And I think that one explanation of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a dogma is a way to gatekeep and to push out dissenters and push out like people who would rock the boat, which is actually what they were saying at Evergreen. They don't want people rocking the boat. They're going to call you out, or you need to get off if you're going to rock this boat. This is just how we do things. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a set of speech codes that you memorize. You have to memorize your privilege and your oppression, and you have to like confess it all. So you're kind of handing over, in a way, you are handing over your conscience to the HR representative or to that trainer. That trainer is teaching you a new morality with new vectors that you might not have known before if you grew up in other climes. This was incubated and designed within academia, and it has all of this kind of these ideas that have been laundered through all these papers, talking about it over and over and over again, all these rhetorical maneuvers. Robin DiAngelo herself perfected her rhetoric or her religion through giving seminar after seminar after seminar and seeing where people would resist her and figuring out all these tricks to put down that resistance, all these Kafka traps, which basically is she'll call you a racist and you're like, well, I'm not a racist. Like, and she'll say, well, that proves that you're a racist. See, your denial of racism is proof of your racism, and you're fragile about that. And the irony is that her entire network of thought is incredibly fragile to actual logical, critical examination. And there's this wonderful writer, Jonathan Church, who's gone through, I don't have his book up now, but you can look up Jonathan Church. He's done a series of essays and articles and at least one book, another book coming out, just dismantling Robin DiAngelo and showing how it's a nest of logical fallacies that don't line up to reality and actually exclude you from connecting to reality. So on one level, one line of attack or criticism would be how it's being implemented at the corporate level. Then another question is, how is it being implemented virally through social media, through public pressure, through peer groups? And you can go through and you can look at all these different small collectives of individuals, from knitting communities to the atheist community, to all these different communities, once this critical social justice stuff comes in. And that's the word I'll use, but we can, talk about it in all these different fashions. One fashionable way of calling it is wokeness or wokeism, but I've been told that has a pedigree that has an authentic side to it. So I'm just going to call it a technical term right now. But once that enters into a group, it shifts the dynamics of the group into this. One, it purges all dissent. It attaches all this meaning to all these symbols and calls all these things racist or bigoted or phobic in one way. And then it destroys that individual's belonging to that group and tightens that belonging of the group. It's basically this virus that turns everything into a cult in a way, by which I mean a lot of policing of behavior, very narrow lens of what's acceptable, and no room for debate. And it's infecting churches and synagogues. And I don't know if it's really gotten into the Muslim community, but it is very generational. And so there's one way of it traveling through the Gen X and the boomer mind, which it is. And then there's another way in which it's traveling through the Gen Z and the millennial mind, which are more speeded up because of their access to social media. And then there's the whole education question.
Right. Yeah. So when I was watching your videos, I think I almost completed the 3rd episode in that series.
I almost got.
I'm gonna finish. I'm gonna have to do it in doses because it blows my mind that these people are going to university, right? Because that's a privilege a lot of people don't get to experience. Like, most people don't get to graduate from college. You're already at an advantage compared to most of the citizens in this country. And you're going to sit there and shout about how unfair life is and how you're in literal violence. And I was curious, like, well, I don't see any literal violence happening except for this mob mentality. And then they're trying to explain that the privilege is showing up because I think someone had called the cops, whether it was like a professor or another student, but
it was just another student.
Yeah, someone had called the cops and like, well, that's a sign of your privilege, and they have mace, and why would they have mace? And it's like, if you know anything about group mentality, the mace probably needs to be there, because it just takes one person to act out, and then all of a sudden that group think happens, and then you're in a really dangerous position. But as I'm watching it, like, none of this makes sense. They're asking to feel included or to feel safe, and that's really gray, right? Like, what does that mean? How can you, I guess, put that in a tangible way? Like, you're in charge of your inner state. So it's just like these roundabout arguments, and they'll be like, well, you need to help us. And they're like, well, how can we help you? And they're like, you need to shut up. Like, how are we paying Robin DiAngelo $5,000 a session to make us?
It's more like 15.
15, holy cow.
Well, she's up to 100,000 now.
Geez. Okay. So whatever she's charging to essentially create this rift between employees or students and staff, where do you see the future of higher education? Are we going to stop paying for college? Because right now, I'm not a cynical person, but I don't see universities having a leg to stand on if they don't make a swift change, because you leave with $100,000 plus in debt for what? To have your kid hate themselves, hate the world, hate their neighbor. What are you paying for?
That's another. So just college alone. And I think that dovetails with what I was saying about the managerial elite. So over the last, 30 years or so, since the government started subsidizing student loans, colleges, it just screwed up the market. So colleges saw that they could charge more. And what would they do with all that money? They pumped it into buildings, a lot of infrastructure, but most of that money went to administration, which is, again, the managerial elite. And the actual power in the institutions has switched from faculty and has kind of gone to the student, but via the student as the consumer. And then there's all this infrastructure that makes sure to insulate the college from, I guess, lawsuits or mishandling of this precious resource called the student, but which is just a bunch of money that the student is now indebted with. But they do a lot of designing of the student experience. There's entire fields of study and administrative positions that are specifically around designing the best experience for the student. I think it's usually called student affairs or something like that, but every college has one. And what they do is they do all the planning of the events and helping the students manage their behavior. But in order to help students manage their behavior, which would mean like if there's something that happened, an altercation that happens between the students, for liability purposes, they put a bunch of training on how to act at the beginning of the school year. And so they'll have these really interesting, anthropologically interesting, seminars on consent around how people should interact sexually. And, so you have all these weird kind of bureaucratization of that part of human experience, which is good from the administrative level because they say, well, we taught you to ask every 5 minutes where your hand should go next and where it should be and blah, 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 blah. But was that actually due to the effect of people actually like experiencing and exploring that, I think, mostly nonverbal activities now imposed with all this bureaucratic mindset. Also that safetyism about that your feelings matter and that if you feel unsafe, you have to stand up and then we will rally a bunch of resources around making you feel safe. That safetyism was very evident in the Evergreen protest, but at colleges at large. And Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt wrote a very wonderful book called Cuddling of the American Mind, which is largely based on Twenge. I can't remember her first name. Her art or her book called iGen, I believe it's called, and she talks about specifically about the rise of social media and that effect on the student. But Lukianoff and Haidt talk about just the attitude towards keeping that child safe has all these different consequences down the road and actually creates a fragile psychology later on down the road. It's an anti-resilient mentality that the college now reinforces, and there's a lot of coddling going on, specifically at Evergreen and elsewhere in the administration and in the faculty. They see these damaged birds that they're caring for, and that they do a lot of patronizing with regards to race that you see specifically in Evergreen, that the Black student is living in a very dangerous world, is very fragile, and so needs all these extra resources and all this extra attention and all these eggshells we're going to scatter around the entire campus so that you don't upset this person that can barely even go to college, barely even step out their door without being shot, which is rhetoric that's actually pushed out by faculty at Evergreen. With regards to college, broadly speaking, there's a lot of different aspects or kind of factors that are creating this situation where now, I can't remember what college, I should be better with facts and names and stuff, but just this past fall, even though it was COVID time and everybody was remote, the students staged this grand protest over something. I can't remember. Wow. Bryn Mawr, I think it was. They staged this grand protest and they shut down classes for 2 weeks. And it was all about this racist incident. It was like an email or somebody drew a poop swastika on the wall. It happens over and over and over again, where this one little incident that could be interpreted as racist is then used as proof that the entire institution needs to be shut down so that we can demand a non-racist safe space. And the way that Bryn Mawr, or whatever this college was that underwent this just this past fall, the president did this apology. Like the college has this down pat now. It's become a rite of passage. Students go to college to protest, to get their cred, to have the status of a protester now. And the college is more than happy to write all the apologies and stop the classes and implement all this training and all this stuff that doesn't have to do with learning an actual skill. It has to do with learning a morality. And so the colleges have returned back to what they originally were, which is a institution of a religion that trains you to be, it has all this science and stuff kind of going outward and this writing and rhetoric, but centrally it's there to program you how to be a good Christian or how to be a good critical social justice activist. So it's reverted back to kind of a religious institution.
So I lost probably the last 10 seconds of what you were saying. If you want to reiterate that really quick. Yeah, it glitched really quick.
Colleges, Western colleges had originally been an extension of the church with different aspects of there's a lot of weird crusty aspects of college are actually descended from the Middle Ages. Just these weird ceremonies and why they wear robes and then all this weird power structure stuff. It descends directly from the Middle Ages. And during the Middle Ages, they originally were all built around Christianity. And then you had all these disciplines that radiated out from Christianity, but it was principally a seminary. And so, if you wanted to do a trade, you would actually work in an industry to get the skills.
Okay,
to be
right. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, I guess, where do you think there's something more nefarious at play? Like, what's the end goal? Because when there's someone back there with like these puppet strings, like what's happening? Because you know that for someone to thrive, you can't make them feel like a victim. You can't make them feel scared and on edge and angry. No one's going to thrive in that mental environment because you're in survival at that point, right? It's almost like they're purposely pushing certain groups into that survival mentality. And if you just look at, that hierarchy of needs, right? You can't get to that next level until the basic levels are met. And it's almost like they're forcing certain groups below that level. Again, what's that end goal? Why would you want someone to be in that space? Like, how does that benefit anybody?
Yeah. There are so many different factors into what is going on. In 2020, we had a lockdown, right?
Yeah.
You remember that?
I feel like some of the country is still there. I'm fortunate enough to be in North Carolina, so
you guys are free.
We're pretty open, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we had that lockdown, and everybody was concerned about death, and death was our highest value. Avoiding death was our highest value. Mm-hmm. And then George Floyd happens, and all of a sudden, our highest value of avoiding death was completely set aside. And the most important value was justice and equity and Black Lives Matter and racial equality and dealing with the sins of America and all of that stuff that had been in the wings, kind of getting ready in academia and then being played with at the HR corporate level, right? And being put into the heads of the students, it all just snapped together. There was this pent up aggression because everybody was on lockdown. All these young people, like, disassociated from school, they couldn't do their tiny little protests at their little colleges. But they could do it all together and take over cities now and all stand up on principle. And then you have the whole effect of the elite and Trump in this pitted battle to get the elite wanted power back to the elite, and Trump was the outsider and they needed to oust him. So there was a lot of dynamics around pushing that. I think that there was a lot of dynamics of not tamping down on that violence because they thought it made Trump look bad and he would tamp down on it. And then they could call him a fascist like they'd already been. So there was this game on the media level that was playing out that was kind of, saying mostly peaceful,
as cars
ignore
are
the fiery
in the
building. Yeah. There's that aspect of it, but it feels like you're trying to get somewhere deeper. And I think that the easiest way to, pardon me, this is an easy way. It's tired though, and it needs more explanation. But it does make sense that we have entered into a secular society where people, which was good to a certain extent, where we have this understanding that the public sphere is divorced from belief. Everybody gets to have their own belief. And that kind of led to people just not wanting to have belief, not wanting to participate in that really boring thing of going to a church with these outdated ceremonies and these funny little stories. And, but those specifically speaking about Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So much of what we are as a society is actually kind of rooted in these old stories and these old ideas. And they're actually iterations of these ideas, going up ideas around justice, ideas around fairness, ideas around individuality, equality under the law. All these ideas are kind of rooted in these kind of premature stories and these wisdom traditions, and then they're dressed up in these ceremonies that sync everybody up, to, they sync up a community to being a community by going through the same ceremony. And then there's this little doctrinal stuff that gives you a story and gives you an explanation and tells you to be better. Let's just give a very good version of the church. It's not always like that. It's not perfect at all, but it's just encouraging you to be better. And I was talking to my dad a few weeks ago. He was talking about, he's a pastor, and he was talking about being in a room with a bunch of other men, and he's the pastor, and they're all trying to be better. And there's a millionaire and a homeless person, or somebody very poor. And that status was gone because they were all equal under God. They were all trying to be better. They were all kind of wrestling with their imperfection, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that way. And that sort of focusing on something transcendent or something deeply personal allowed those outer differences to kind of be released for that time, and all that class consciousness and all the tensions of that kind of operating, and kind of makes a community. And that's all built in. So there's all these structures that were in the church that weren't updated. I think that the church is really guilty for not really updating it. And so people just kind of left it because we had TV, we had other ways of getting together, we had all these other communities, but there's still a latent desire on a community level for some sort of religion. Individuals can be secular, but once these religious tendencies start to vibrate, they match up with other people, and people start to vibrate, and in this religious fervor of wanting to do something meaningful, of being together in this community, doing something real in the world. And without a story there that they all have to land on, any old story will work. And the thing about critical social justice, it's kind of all these ideas, and they're all about systemic oppression and implicit bias and the need for justice and some Marxism kind of conflict theory. There's the good guys and the bad guys, and the good guys are the have-nots, and the bad guys are the haves, and so we need to overthrow that. And then there's these racial things and these gender things and this sexuality thing, and then of course we're America, so we're always kind of protesting, we're always kind of trying to upgrade our society. So there's that in our blood and stuff. But there was missing at the Evergreen State College. I heard so much Christianity, but only one half. All the sin, all the guilt, all the confession, all the shame, no redemption other than submission to another person. And then confession that the world itself is evil. It's very Gnostic. The world itself is this corrupted system. It's a patriarchal, heteronormative, capitalist structure that's excreting all of our reality and hogging all our authenticity to ourselves, and then forcing us to judge each other and look down on each other and stuff. So there's that, which is like a god. And then there's all this implicit stuff like sin, like, oh, I have all these biases, and even if I'm Black and I disagree, that means I have internalized white supremacy. It stains everything. Everything is racist. That's Robin DiAngelo again. So this religious structure kind of comes in there, and there's nothing else there in that space between people. Insofar as religion isn't just a personal relationship with your authenticity, your soul, and your God, but there's this community structure between people that kind of, like, the religion that was there was eroded, and it probably was outdated. It probably needed to be really just kind of dilapidated so it can rise again. But what we have is a false religion rising in that gap. That is the deepest, that's like the beginning of the deepest level for me of this, and then trying to figure out that level of that, of just basic human experience in America at this time.
I think that's an amazing analogy. I've heard it compared to a religion before, but not at that depth. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think we as human beings always, like you said, have that need or that kind of void that we want to fill with something bigger than us. And right now it's not in vogue to say that you're religious. Like the closest you can really say and get away with it is saying that you're spiritual, right? Like a lot of people are like, oh, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. And sorry, in my experience, I think we're all kind of talking about the same thing, right? But there's a lot
What is that
of
thing?
I think that we're all saying that there's a God, and for some reason we don't want to say, we can't say God anymore. So that's why we say, some people say source now. Some people will say spirit or the universe, and you have to call it by these other things. Otherwise you're like, ooh, people are going to think I'm weird, or I'm going to be more of an outsider, or no one's going to take me seriously. But we're all talking about the same thing. Even when you talk about different religions, if you're talking about Nirvana or Allah or whatever, I think we're all just talking about this more pure force that's bigger and greater than us that we're trying to essentially return to. I don't know, maybe I'm like over generalizing.
No, I like that. Yeah.
That's my take on it.
It jives with me.
So to like argue about these words that, that are dirty, or Christianity is bad, or being Jewish is bad, or being Muslim is bad, all of these, we're all, for the most part, in the purest sense, we kind of agree, I think, more than we disagree. And what I think is interesting too is there's almost like an intrinsic shame that a lot of us have. And I think that's, so if you talk about the medieval times when you would repent and you would take like a whip, you would whip yourself, right?
Yeah. That was a particularly outlier case. That did happen. It wasn't always there, but there was confession, and there was,
I've watched too many movies.
Yeah. Well, but that guilt, channeling that shame and channeling that guilt through a process of collective conscience building, not consciousness, but conscience building. And just the act of confession itself, where you go to a priest, you share your sins. I'm borrowing from Jonathan Peugeot here. And then your sins are kind of dispersed through the community, because the priest kind of takes them onto himself. And then so you're not holding all of that inadequacy to yourself and all that mistake to yourself.
Yeah. And then what we're missing now is that road to redemption, or that grace. So that's what's missing in the social justice version or in the critical race version, because it's almost like they will demand an apology if you do anything that goes against the dogma. But then once you apologize, you're still canceled. Like right now, I like tweeted the other day, I was like, are we trying to cancel a state right now? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, what was it about? Which state? Oh, with Georgia.
Yeah, so I can't remember who it was some commentator. And he was like, it's no coincidence that they call it the Masters tournament. And I was like, you are reaching. And like,
oh, okay.
It's kind of, it's like that race lens that people talk about. If you put these glasses on and you look for racism, everything's racist. Or if you look for sexism,
the master bedroom.
Yeah. Right. And I'm like, I don't know. I always thought when I heard masters, I thought of mastery, right? Which is something that a lot of us don't have or aren't even trying to get, which I think is a lot of the lack of purpose, which leads to everyone being mad and everyone going on social media and everyone being in a constant state of outrage. So I thought of it in a positive way. It's like mastery, right? Like these are the world's best, most elite golfers. Mastery, right?
Yeah. Which is based on merit, which is a problematic concept in the grand scheme of critical social justice or whatever it is. Merit, they don't like that. Because that would include too much personal responsibility and obscure all the accident of birth, which there's something to be said about, we're not all bootstrapping ourselves. We come from lineages and stuff.
Yeah, I heard Sam Harris break that down, and what was he saying? He was basically saying you can't really take you can't take credit for almost anything. And he went like way too far on the other side of it. So I'm like, well, there's still a lot of hard work and decision making and, making the right choices. Like just because you're talking about an athlete, right? Just because you're born 6'8", that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be an MVP and make a career out of it.
To speak of that strict determinism, which is, I guess, Sam's a strict determinist, or very outgoing. Everything's determined. Everything's predetermined. Basically, you don't have any free will. It's all kind of just an accident, and you're not aware of your decisions. Your decisions are being made by all these neural networks, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with thinking that way, you can, again, the individual can abstract themselves into the state where they're objectively viewing the world as all these accidental things. But between people, if that becomes dominant, that we're all just accidents, and that becomes the substance between us, in our secular, between one individual and another, if that becomes the way that we're, the soup that we're swimming in, you get these really weird emergent properties of people calling themselves bodies, the black bodies, and talking about their own selves as though they are, and that's a word that's used in the Evergreen protest, and it is a protest lens, or critical social justice lens, where they distill everybody into bodies, and they talk about the harm that's being inflicted by the system on the body. But in action, once you start thinking of yourself as a body and you're no longer responsible, you can act however you want. You can be as shameless as possible. You're not free from shame. That shame will always be haunting you because you are a conscious creature. But in that moment, you can be shameless. And a lot of the Evergreen footage is just completely shameless because they're acting on a global scale. They're no longer acting as humans towards humans. They're acting as bodies in this great historical pinball game where they're going to smash through these structures and create, I guess, something better that they call community love, whatever that looks like, which is actually in practice is just infinite guilt and shame and scapegoating everybody, putting all the guilt on one person,
there's
kicking
not
them
a lot of love in those videos.
Yeah.
That's not how you get to love.
Yeah. So I don't know how love, I think love is another concept that could be easier, more expansive and more relatable term to kind of flesh out the concept of God, and how such a concept, such a universal concept, or such a concept as universal love being the glue that imperfectly kind of ties people together, but at least provides the conditions for what conditions are there if there's love between us, as opposed to, I guess, determinism or racism, oppression, and stuff. If you start looking at that, can love embrace all of that pain and suffering better than seeing all that oppression and pain and suffering can embrace love? Can you ever get to love through pain and suffering? Can you get to pain and suffering through love? I think love's actually more powerful, actually.
Oh, 100%. Even if you look at David Hawkins, like his hierarchy of emotions, so he breaks everything down into frequency. And I mean, this is science. Everyone always thinks that it's crazy when I talk about this, or that it's like a woo-woo, but it's measurable. So love is, I want to say, the second to highest vibration that you can experience. I think joy is above that. Or maybe it's joy or peace. But yeah, if you go down into like the anger or the apathy or jealousy, all of those are super, super low. And that's where you actually start. If you're familiar with Joe Dispenza, that's where you actually start to get sick. Your body actually starts to get sick. So things like cancer can start to grow, and autoimmune issues.
I know certainly society gets sick when it's run on anger and greed and envy. And those things will always be there, but they need to be put into, they need to be ruled by principles, principles would be something that serves love, joy, and peace. Right. But once anger becomes the rule, I mean, and so to kind of just ping back to what you asked me that I didn't answer, I was on campus. It was really silly at first, but it got really bad, and not terrifying, but really bad. And I because we're in a safe space right now, we can talk about energy. The energy of the place was the most darkest, closest thing to palpable. I don't say this word lightly, and I mean it lightly. It was evil. There was something evil, and not during the protest, but afterward, there was a spirit over that just was everywhere. I could barely breathe. That's why I started making the videos, because I'm like, I have to get this out of me. I could barely breathe because it was just so heavy and oppressive. And if I was walking around campus, and one time I was walking to get my coffee on campus, and I saw a black man, And I got really scared. I'm like, oh God, I'm gonna get attacked now. And I looked at him like, this is crazy. I never, ever want to think this way. And I
Right.
never did until
Mm-hmm.
this godforsaken progressive college taught me that, taught everybody that that's the order of the day. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was the exact opposite of love. And that's the weird thing, because I was at all these trainings. And I'm like, you're trying to teach charity and you're trying to teach respect, but you're not using those words and you're not producing that thing that I think is what you want.
Mm-hmm.
And so it crumbled. It was vice. I don't know. That's like the weird kind of narrative poetic side of my story, uh, experientially with it.
No, I think that that makes a lot of sense. It's like certain people can walk into a room and they're either energizing it and making it brighter, or they can suck all of the air out of it. And I think when you have that many people that are on the same frequency, what is clearly of anger and clearly of fear and everything that's on that lower vibrational hierarchy scale, it makes sense that that's going to kind of radiate out and kind of linger. It doesn't just dissipate because the people leave. It doesn't dissipate because the cameras go off. It's just there.
Yeah,
And all of these
yeah,
things have a ripple effect.
yeah.
And where I see everyone going wrong, whether it's these professors or these CEOs that are bringing in people to teach these, equality seminars or whatever they are, is they're letting everyone stay there and just apologizing. Like when I was watching, I think it was the episode 1, maybe, it was going through the lineup of, I think, different professors, and they were essentially apologizing for who they were. They're like, I'm so sorry, I'm privileged, I'm cis. I hate the word cis. Like, I refuse to use it to describe anyone, but they called themselves, I'm cis and I'm hetero and I'm white and I'm a man, so I'm got the trifecta of all of the privilege, you know what I mean? Like apologizing for these immutable characteristics.
Yeah.
And then kind of, I guess it's almost like giving the leash to a violent dog instead of correcting the behavior you don't want to see, or trying to rehabilitate it with love. Or like there's all these other approaches you can do, but just saying, I'm going to take my hands off of the wheel and let you steer the boat, I think is the absolute worst thing that you can do. I think we can acknowledge that someone might feel all of these things. Like maybe you feel that you have had a bad experience at college, or you've had a bad experience in the workplace. But how do we get to a place of loving each other? And how do we get to a place of understanding? And if you can't get there, your reality is not going to change. It doesn't matter how I act or how I behave. If you don't get to a place of love, your reality is not going to change. So again, it takes that accountability out, right? Like your mindset is your reality. It's not me. It's not the environment. It's your mindset. And for some reason, no one's addressing that. It's not, you create your own reality.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the locus of, it's called hypo agency. It's something that a good friend of mine, I wish she still produced videos. She doesn't. She retired. Her tag name was Alice Void. Very, very sharp Canadian philosopher. And she did a great video about hypoagency, specifically criticizing feminism for making females always the weakest one. Like really leaning into the female is historically oppressed and all of her decisions are made for her. It eventually puts all the agency or all the intention outside. You don't have any anymore because you're just a part of the system. And that leads to a bunch of, I guess, sicknesses of behavior and stuff. And also, like, just speaking about feminism, that kind of obscures a lot of the less obvious powers of communication and of kind of steering the boat from the back that historically I think women did a lot of, but weren't written down in song, weren't really detailed, because my supposition is that women were transmitting a lot of knowledge verbally that wasn't actually written down until later on in history. So that sense of hypoagency or displacing the individual's locus of control of their environment and also of their self onto the environment. It leads to a lot of powerlessness and then anger and resentment. And then what happens, and this is the amazing thing about evergreens, that then who eventually gets up in power is the most narcissistic, sociopathic individuals completely dominate this entire oppressed thing. The person with the right characteristics can now manipulate everybody. And if they're charismatic enough and articulate enough, everybody has to follow along because anything else is violence. And you see that now with Peter Boghossian, who's a professor at the Portland State University. He's been writing about how this ideological faction within his college of these critical social justice scholars are now construing any criticism as harassment, which is incredibly sociopathic and narcissistic. That means that you can never question this person, but they can always call you out and always dominate you and push their ideas, which are very invasive, as we see, upon everybody else. So there's a lot of, I think you're really on the right track. And this is kind of the place I try to go to, because we can analyze all these structures from the systemic and the institutional to the rhetorical, all these different moves. But it's like, well, what are we trying to do here? And where are we all the same? And you go back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s, I want to judge people based on the content of their character. And what does that even mean? Like, I think that phrase is tossed around in the anti-woke discourse and the classical liberal discourse, but we have to really get down to like, okay, what is it to have a content? And I love how you're bringing up like these vibrancies and these feelings, these phenomenal realities that we inhabit and that we can choose to go through, and then somehow that creates a character. And what is a character? And then you actually have to go through, well, what is a character in relationship to? It's reality or God or the spirit. And then that's what I used to guide me when I was sitting through all these trainings where people want me to look at people's race and their sex and their gender and label them correctly. I'm like, I want to see the individual first. And there's all this pattern recognition: woman, man, black, white. And then more importantly than black and white is their body posture and their tone of voice. Like, where are you coming from? Like, what's your state? Like, that's how I assess somebody. What is your state? And then I'm like, well, I'm going to speak to the who you are. And I had a lot of time with children working in preschool for a long time. So I kind of have this, I kind of see who they always are. That's who I want to connect with. And there's always these barriers and stuff. And my job as a communicator is to break through those barriers and make a connection, which is through humor or through some version of love, joy, or peace. That's how you make the connection. Not all this pattern recognition, all this bias stuff and anti-bias stuff. All that stuff gets right in the way of that connection. Speaking of connection, are you still connected?
Yes, I'm still connected. Yeah. No, I think that makes so much sense. And I always found it really interesting when people hyper-focus on identifying as these things that are immutable. Like, you can't change that. Well, you can't change what race you were born. You can't change what sex you were born. And we're so focused on that as being so, I guess, definitive of who you are. And if you spend any time with spirituality or with religion or
even creativity too.
With any kind of introspective work, you realize those things don't really matter, I guess, to a point. Like, I don't walk around all day thinking that I'm a woman. Like, I know I'm one, and it's not an active part of my thought process throughout the day. I'm sure it probably defines a lot of my behaviors or decision making, but it's not something that I'm like hyper focused on. I'm not hyper focused on my race. I mean, I don't know. There's so much more that's interesting about me or about you or about anybody than these immutable characteristics. And it's almost like we don't want to explore that territory, or maybe we just simply don't know the answers to that. So then we're just, this is who I am.
There's ways of establishing spaces for that discourse, those discussions, and that intermingling of humans to happen. I think that we have been kind of like the cheese of our society has been smushed through the grater of social media. And there are different technologies that are emerging. I see you on Clubhouse. I think that that's a really good, I've been learning a lot. I've been learning a lot about African Americans and their communication style and the way that they talk and the way that even the way they interrupt one another, and also so all their behavior and their vibe, but then also where they're coming from, and like, their experiences, and trying to deal with their position as a group in a society. So there are realities to identity. There are realities to all these different intersectional standpoints. There is a reality there.
Right.
The intersectionality based on critical theory is only good at breaking people apart. It does not provide that coming together, other than coming together to exhaust our oppression. And again, to return to Evergreen, what I saw behind the scenes, what everybody saw, was that the college took up this social justice goal, and they started becoming more and more empathetic and more concerned with people expressing their emotions. And everything kind of turned into a therapy session. But there was no real good, solid training by anyone on how to be a good therapist, let alone a good group therapist. So part of the thing that's broken with the Evergreen State College footage, that protest, is that you see half of a therapy session. You see kind of half, like that cathartic release, but you don't see anything other than demands for obedience at the end of that. You don't see any filling that circle of coming back together, because they can't do it, because it's based on something that denies that in some way. In some way, there's something in critical social justice, intersectionality, and critical theory, and with the dash of postmodernism, it's really good at corroding. And so it doesn't provide the spaces. It provides a lot of friction, spaces where friction happens. So I don't think we have I think part of our work has to be, is to bring up voices. I do it one-on-one, bring up voices and interview in a relaxed manner all these different people from different identity groups. But there can be communal spaces we have to go, but we have to have an overarching sense of community. And that itself is being corroded actively by all these theories that are saying it's all oppression, it all needs to be torn down. So without that balloon, faulty though it may be, without that dome of, I don't know if America, but at least the human, let alone, like, if you want to go higher, then you can say God, which I think gives me personally more access to more states of being. But I am American, but I have to find that way of being together with people. And we need to work on that structure, so that all these identities and positions and then all the problems, and then hopefully some of the solutions can come to light.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a need for, I don't know how to say this. There's a need for those spaces, absolutely. And I think everyone has experiences that are really shitty, and they need to find people that can relate to those shitty experiences, right? It helps you feel normal and seen and accepted, and all of those beautiful things that we need. But when I'm saying that it's almost counterproductive to hyper focus on these identities that we can't change, like race or gender, is because if you scope out, like when you said, if you scope out to God, right? If you scope out that far, we're all the same. We all came from the same space, and we're all made of stars. Like that is our DNA. It sounds like a Moby song, but it's true. And there's this oneness, and we all return to the same place. So when we focus on these things that are our Achilles heel, right, as a country, like race is definitely our Achilles heel. It's something that it's still very raw for a lot of people. I don't think you can it's a lot harder to arrive at that place of oneness, or that place of love, or that place of, have you ever done those? Do you meditate?
No.
So there's a lot of meditations that Joe Dispenza does, and he's like a world-renowned leader when it comes to like self-healing, and he does like seminars all over the world. And some of the meditations he does, my husband does all the time. They're like 2 hours long, and it's trying to become no one. So it's like, who are you when you become no one? When you detach yourself from this meat sack of a body, right? That's, you're going to exist further then. Like once this thing is dead and gone, you don't cease to exist. There's a soul or a spirit or an energy that lives on, right? So what is that? That's the important thing. That's the intelligent thing. That's the sense of I. I think a lot of times we get, I guess, confused that this is I, right? Like this body is I, but you were something before and you're going to be something after. And I think when we focus on our differences, it's so much harder to, again, get to love, which is the more positive place. And that's what we all want. Those people that are so angry and screaming and borderline violent, they need love more than anybody. And that was something I think that you're really good at, is when you were narrating some of your videos on the Evergreen stuff, you were talking about this one professor who she was very angry. She did a lot of shouting. I can't remember her name. And you were explaining why her mental state was where it was at. And you did a really good job at explaining her reality and where she was coming from. And I think a lot of people don't do that. So I really appreciated that insight.
I know who you're talking about.
What was her name?
That poor woman. She left Evergreen. She got a settlement, $250,000. And then she goes to this art community or whatever in Tulsa and ends up suing them for the same thing she sued Evergreen for. She's just carrying around her trauma. And
so who's the common denominator there, right?
Yeah.
I had this speaking of, we're looking for a new nanny right now. And I had this application the other day, and she was like, okay, so I think it's important that I let you know that I have a service dog, which is fine. You know, I don't have an issue with that. The service dog is for a lot of childhood trauma that I've had. So very specific. And she says, I've had a lot of experience with negative situations and I'm really good in them. Specifically hospitalizations, traumas, abuse, and names all these things. And I was like, whoo, I do not want that energy in my house or around my family. Sounds like you've had a rough go. I didn't, and obviously not interviewing this person, but there's a lot of people like that where that's their normal, and they don't, I guess, maybe you can't when you're in that state, but you don't take a step back and say, what's the common factor that keeps here? Is it me or is this experience unique? If this experience is unique, maybe there's, something else happening, but if it's a pattern, then maybe there's something I have to look inside of myself to try to break that pattern.
There is an aspect of activist culture that attracts traumatized individuals and then concentrates that trauma and then acts as a justification for maladaptive behaviors related to that trauma. Basically, a whole bunch of acting out to solve the world, but not really understanding that you're trying to solve something in here, right? It's very clean your room. It's very clean your room. Right?
I know. I love that rule. Make your bed.
I never do that, but
I'm really bad at that too. Every time, like, Jordan Peterson would be really mad at me right now. Trying to change the world with the podcast, but my bed's not made. I was definitely one of those people, though. I got sucked into one of those women's gender studies classes when I was a senior. I needed that, random class to get a credit.
What caught you or captured you about that?
I thought it was so I was a psych major, so I thought it was just an extension of a psychology class. I didn't really know anything about it, and I heard that it was a fun class. That's what I heard from like other people, and I was like, I don't know, I need an extracurricular, and I'll just throw it in, and maybe I'll learn something about women and sexuality. And they show you day one was this awful video of like this the story of this trans person getting murdered. And that's where they opened, and I'm like crying, and I'm like, the world is this evil place. Me and I was in South Carolina, so, they're talking about how awful the South is, which is weird at a Southern school. And you get so emotionally invested in these stories because they're just these individual stories. It's not to take away from the violence or those wrongdoings, because obviously no one's condoning that, but they make it seem a lot more prevalent, I think, than it is. So what's actually ironic, or I guess what started, I guess, for me to see things differently, because I went from thinking everything was bad and evil and not accepting. So I actually started I can't remember the name of it. I think it was called it was like a pride group or something. Like there was no spaces for like the gay community on campus at all. Like it got kind of shut down and whatever. I was like, okay, I'll do this. Like I'll create this space and then give it to someone who's actually a member of this group, because I don't belong as the president because I'm straight. So I create this group, hand it over to somebody else, and we had like tables out on the lawn and people were signing up and creating like meetings, and there was food and drinks, and like everyone was so nice. Like everyone was so nice. There was not a single negative interaction that I had at all. And I was like, okay, well, maybe this place isn't as bad as that teacher said, because no one was like, move your booth or get out of here, slur a word or nothing. Everyone was like, this is a party. We had music and it was wonderful. And I'm pretty sure that club is still open. So that's awesome. But it just kind of showed me like the world's not as bad as those classes tell you that it is. And I don't know why we're trying to scare the shit out of young people before they go into the real world.
Me and a friend, Mike Nino, were tooling around with writing a script, trying to take our knowledge and put it into a dramatic form. And I had this, I kept on returning to this image of this girl who's 18 or 19, and she shows up on campus just like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. And she gets involved in one of these courses that starts to break her down and show her these evil things and just reduces her state and just bombards her with negativity, and then bombards her with love, and the negativity of the world and love from us and negativity from the world. And just like watching this really innocent, peppy girl like be transformed into this raging harpy, like going around and like demanding people change their behavior, and just watching that happen just to show that the output of a lot of this stuff, there are psychological tools or kind of these reprogramming ways. I don't know if they're emergent. I don't know if they're intentional, but people are being turned into this stuff. Like what you were saying really brought that up to me. And there was one other thing you were making me think of about, Deborah So. So Deborah So, you've had her on?
Yeah, I've had her on twice. And then she actually just had me on her podcast that just launched.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. She's wonderful. I want to have her on again. Yeah. I was talking to her and Abigail Schreier, and they both came out with books about, Abigail Schreier talked about rapid onset gender dysphoria within teen girls mostly. And then Deborah wrote about gender. And we were talking about the school system, because they both get into the school system and the stuff that's being pushed there and how it's not based on reality, how all this gender stuff is not based on reality. It's based on feelings. Do you feel this way? Do you feel that way? It's not, it's the reality's over there, but your real self is over here. So it is religious. It's very religious. They do everything except say in these documents that are in public schools that your gender is your soul. They do everything except say that it's your soul, but they're describing the soul, which is this gender binary thing that's fluid and exists outside. Anyways, so I was asking Deborah, I'm like, well, why teach this irreality? Why put this distinction between all this language about sex, which is really useful in the real world, really useful for understanding how it works, understanding the consequences, understanding if it's violated too, which is one of my big worries about this gender stuff. Occluding sex is that you now have these children who can't even name if they're being molested anymore, because now there's all this language about, well, maybe it was okay because this and that, and everything's fluid. Anyways, but Deborah's point was that once you teach this to children, or any sort of thing that's not based reality to children, they can't verify anything themselves. They have to verify it through this outer system that you can then control. They can't verify physical reality anymore. They're in this world that you then control, and then you have access to dictating, and they're completely reliant on you to tell them what reality is. It's a very, I don't know if that's intentional or not. She didn't say it was intentional or not, but the effect is that you have a bunch of young people who aren't really connected to their bodies, let alone to their souls. So there is like this broken religion, like you're saying, when you're talking about the soul, you're talking about the body. I understand that. I have experiences of that. I have experiences of before life, after life. I understand myself as a continuum. But there's all that in there too, but it's dressed up in all of this other stuff. And then I see the action of that is that it doesn't locate the agency and the reality and the personal experience. It locates it in all these terms, all this language that's always melting in this postmodern way with all this oppression that's animating everything. So there's just something weird that's very spiritual about it, very Gnostic about it, but it's hidden. So I trust it even less because they hide it.
Yeah, that's where the whole thing on gender is. It makes you dizzy.
Oh no, we ended up in gender somehow.
Yeah,
we turned that corner.
We did. It makes me. I've read Dr. Deborah So's book. She writes it in a very digestible way. But unless you come from that world or constantly carry a notebook with these stats or like the scientific findings, it's very dizzying. And then you have these people that talk about fluidity. Where I struggle with it is, well, first, do you think that the soul has a gender?
Like once I can tell you a story.
Yeah,
please. I can tell you a story. Okay, so I have a spiritual practice. It's called Subud, and it's a contraction of 3 Sanskrit words meaning Susila, Buddhi, and Dharma. But it's based on the actual practice is a direct receiving, where I relax and then I receive something. It starts as an energy, as a tingle, and then it kind of rises up into song and dance or words or thoughts, so it's this something that's coming from inside of me out. And that suits me and I get a lot out of it. And there's this really cool thing where every once in a while you get an insight. And I was in this really relaxed state one day. This is a while ago. I was in this relaxed state and I was curious. I'm like, well, what is my masculine side? And I just felt it just from a very quiet place. I just felt my masculine. And then I asked, well, what is my feminine? And from that state, I just felt that. And there were 2 distinct energies. Like there was this femininity and this masculinity. And they're like, well, what is it like? What am I like? What is my state like when those are in harmony? And I just felt complete. I felt like totally relaxed, calm, engaged, soft and hard at the same time in a way. It was amazing. So I think that, I have a lot of masculine functions in the world. I probably have more masculinity than femininity. I don't go into that gender stuff because it's so romantic. But when I write my fictions and I have a female character, I project my femininity into that vessel, and there's different females. They're not all just one female. There's all these, some of them are really scary. Some of them are really awesome. Some are beautiful. Some are powerful. Some are weak. Some are sad, and then when I write my men, I kind of locate my more masculine form. So I play out my gender through fiction. I locate it in fiction, and then I have the interaction of the masculine and fiction in a symbolic world that hopefully, eventually, someday might be digestible by other people or might be entertaining or enlightening to other people because I'm communicating something by using those symbols. So it does make sense to me as a narrative form, but going around the world and feeling my gender this and my gender that, and then demanding that everybody see that part of me, it's like, no, that's unartistic. I will evoke that feeling in you, but I'm not going to demand anything. That's unartistic. That's a violation of the artistic principle. I don't know how we got there. What's your gender soul?
I like that where you say that you're going to evoke it instead of demand it.
Yeah. I mean, that's what the artist is supposed to do.
Yeah. So I feel like that concept is, I think that the idea of gender, or whether you want to talk about, you know, the divine feminine, the divine masculine, which is terms you hear a lot now, or just those energies in general. I think a lot of that's probably attached to ego. And what they say is that the ego dies with the body. It's not part of the soul. Like, it's its own thing.
Okay.
Because I don't think a dog walks around and is like, I'm feminine and I'm, you know, like, they know that they're a female, but it's not like, it's not like I can wear dresses or I can wear lipstick or whatever is traditional in your culture, right? Which kind of goes against the idea that, you know, I don't know where I was going with that, but
well, I have a boy cat and a girl cat, and they are definitely, one's a female, one's a boy, but they're not all females are female, not all males are masculine in cats, but there's definitely differences between them. They have different duties and roles.
But I'm saying, like, they're not going around demanding that other cats recognize their femininity.
No,
you know what I mean? Like, it's not,
unless they're in heat.
Is.
You know,
it just is. But when it comes to, like, souls, I don't think so. I don't think that a soul has a gender. I think that's a human experience. It's here for the human experience.
Have you felt that? Have you experienced, like, that state of non-duality in a way?
Briefly. I've had like dwindling moments. So what I do, so I'm trying to make this a more regular thing, but I go to this thing called Bio-Cybernaut, and it's brain training.
Can you say that again? Bio-Cybernaut.
Bio-Cybernaut. But it's the coolest thing. I think if every single person could go, the world would be a better place. Everyone would be happier, healthier, wealthier, all of the things. But when you're there, it's kind of like you're doing, like, really deep meditations for what I would say a couple hours at a time in a almost sensory deprivation. You do have neurofeedback, so you can hear your brainwaves, but that's it. But other than that, it's like a pitch black room, and you're sitting, and you're not, you know, there's not a lot of stimuli happening. No, not in salt. It's just so it's in like a very small room. It's completely, once they turn the lights off, it's completely black. It's like double doored. You're connected to the wall behind you with your neurotransmitters, and they come out as an auditory feedback response. So you can kind of hear, like, okay, I'm producing alpha in my right occipital or my right frontal, and I'm producing it in my left temporal, whatever. And let's try to get, you know, cohesion going around. It's this really cool thing that you just try to purposely manipulate your brainwaves. And when you're in these really deep meditations, whether you're in a high alpha state or a high theta state, because he offers, like, multiple kinds of trainings, there is a sense that you're no longer in your body. It's almost like your body disappears and you're just experiencing. You're just experiencing these noises. So in those moments, I'm not even Candice. I'm not a woman. I'm just the observer. Yeah. And
like
it's like it's the only way I can really explain it. So when you get to those levels, you realize how silly all of these things are. But where I was going with that, with the gender thing, is if the soul doesn't have a gender, then part of it is like, okay, well, like, you know, gender is fluid and it can change and it's this elusive thing. I feel like they're kind of using that as leverage, I guess, to manipulate the human experience. And I think two things can be true at the same time. I think that your soul can not have a gender, but while you're here having your human experience, I think that you're born into the body that you are for a purpose. I think that there are certain lessons, hardships, and gifts that come out of that. I don't think life is supposed to be easy. I don't think, coming from my own experience, that, you know, growing up in a female body is not the easiest when you're going through puberty and you have all of these ads being thrown at your face with these gorgeous women that all look like Giselle. Like, it's a very uncomfortable time, right? And part of the journey is to have love and appreciation for your imperfections and be okay with everything that is uncomfortable. So I think, the soul can be genderless, but while you're here in this human experience, that there's two genders. And by trying to make that any more confusing than simply saying that. It's to kind of hide from your purpose or your truth or the reason that you're here on this earth.
Well, I think what you bring up with the ego is a key word. Like, because there's a lot of, every Sunday, Twitter props up some sort of LGBT plus hashtag, and you go over to it. It's yesterday was LGBT cuties, right? And all it is a bunch of young people taking sexy photos of themselves. It's just like a whole stream of people looking for adoration, right? And it's just like, it's to bring awareness of what? That you're attractive or available, or you want some sort of recognition. So and that's really, really shallow, but this realm of gender, or this codification of this concept of gender into some sort of reservoir of self, and then of connectivity through all these other genders, and then sexualities too. 10-year-olds now are having these conversations like, what's your sexuality? Like, are you pan? Are you bi? Are you, pharaoh gender? Like, you're attracted to magnets, or what is it? And, which is disturbing on a couple levels, but you just see how far this idea has gotten, where you have, and I was bringing up that example because I was interviewing a philosopher. His 10-year-old kid, through Zoom, after the teacher left, all the kids started talking about their sexualities. And I've talked to Sasha Ayad about this, who's a therapist for teenagers, and her big insight, one of her main insights, she's very insightful, so I shouldn't say her main or major insight, but one of her insights that she gifted unto me was that a lot of the gender stuff, specifically regarding females going through rapid onset gender dysphoria, or a lot of gender issues that females are experiencing, is because their mind is developed and plugged into the internet, and they're getting all this data that's not sensual anymore. It's all verbal, or even pornography, which is removed from the body. So they're getting all this information, and then they're being asked, well, what is my desire? What do I desire? Am I lesbian? Am I gay? What am I? And I've spoken with a lot of detransitioners, like females who did steps to become men, or to take hormones, or at least to identify as males. And some of them turn out to be lesbian at the end. And I try to respectfully ask, well, to what degree was your desire involved in this? To what degree did you even have a sexuality before they had all these terms? And a lot of them didn't even actually feel any desire for anybody. It was all up here into what they are. It was all this identity stuff. So there's this mismatch where the cart is leading the horse. The horse isn't even ready, and the cart's already going downhill, right? In a way. So I forgot my original point, but gender seems to be this way for, it's this new language that's really hip that people are exploring right now. But ultimately, you can look at all their byproduct, and it's been going on for ages. Like, this is nothing new for a guy to wear lipstick, David Bowie, and all these guys. It's a long tradition. That doesn't mean you're not a man.
Right.
It doesn't mean you're not a woman. But what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? To what degree do we need men's only spaces? To what degree do we need women's only spaces? And I'm not just talking bathrooms. I'm talking clubs and activities. To what degree do we develop when we're in a room, in a space with our own sex? And to erase sex bars us from exploring that, and maybe bars us from a lot of evolutionary data that gets unlocked when we're among our own subkind.
Yeah, I think those spaces are vital. I think they're absolutely vital, especially when you're younger and you're growing up. I think I was listening to a podcast. It might have been Brett Weinstein's, but I could be mistaken. But he was talking about the importance of men's spaces. And I'm very ignorant to that because I'm not a man. So I've never been in men's only spaces. And it's funny because the narrative was always like, that's sexist, right? So the clubhouse or country club we're members of, like, they have a men's only 16th hole and a women's only space. And we're like, well, that's so sexist that the women can't go into that room because that's the only room with a bar. So it's very easy to break it down and say, well, they're just trying to exclude us.
Yeah.
But then you listen to his podcast and he's like, there's a lot that happens in men's only spaces. Like we can correct each other's bad behavior in private, right? So we don't have to chastise you on Twitter and ruin your reputation. We can say, hey, like you were acting like a dick. We need to fix this. This behavior is not acceptable. So there's that aspect of it. There's just like certain jokes that aren't going to land well, maybe with women. There's ways to bring each other up. There's networking. There's just a lot. There's sharing your experiences as men.
And the energy is very, to speak energy wise, like the energy of a women's space and a men's space, really different. I've had experiences of like being shown that I don't belong in women's spaces and just like dreams about my energy intruding on the female. And that I there's parts of me that I can't suppress that would dominate a female group. I'm more beady and they're more sing-songy. It was just, I've had experiences about that, like kind of visceral experiences on that level, but also socially and all that stuff.
Right. So, and those are all undeniable. So I think it's silly to say that those places can't exist or that, it's causing exclusion or whatever, because there's plenty of shared spaces.
Yeah.
And I think no one mentions that, like almost every space, especially now because everything's digital, is a shared space. Yeah. But I think it's interesting that when you were talking about that therapist, she was saying that because so much stuff is online, that's kind of creating confusion. And that makes a lot of sense because you're not having that energetic connection or where you are experiencing what attraction feels like, right? It's different. Even if you're watching porn, which it obviously is meant to make you feel certain things, it's not the same. And they've done fMRIs. The brain is different when you watch porn and orgasm than when you orgasm with a person. Like there's actually a neural difference. Yeah. And I think, the stuff like the lockdown and not spending time with people because now we're also scared of getting germs. I think it's going to be really detrimental to this because if we're already seeing a rapid onset for young girls specifically, I wonder if that's going to get worse now.
I heard rumors that actually some of that, I haven't seen any studies and stuff, but I've seen because of the communities that I'm connected to through my exploration of it. So it is kind of a selection bias on my behalf, but it seems that without that social pressure, some of the identifying as trans is leaking. There's actually some coded articles coming out that I've seen the last few days about women saying, I don't feel queer anymore. And then they get a haircut from their boyfriend. Like, okay, I'm queer again.
I saw a tweet you did.
My hedge was feeling the same way. So I went out there with some clippers and a half hour later I have a queer lawn again.
Right. So what's that?
Yeah. Am I queer there was another article that I saw. Am I queer without anybody seeing me? Or does I'm losing my gender identity because nobody's seeing me? So gender identity is a stand-in for connection or some sort of filter on connection that for some reason has gone really viral. Hidden behind that is some queer theory, which I don't think is actually manifesting in the actual social dynamics of social media and stuff. And you have those TikTok videos. You have these weird just hive minds that are going around and messing with all these ideas. The only problem is that now we have the technology to inject all these hormones into yourself with consequences that people aren't necessarily capable or really thinking about or are being minimized in those communities. Is not that big a deal. So there's a lot of things that are not good because of the way that we can affect our reality onto our bodies imperfectly now, but permanently.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I think is alarming that they're not being more honest about. So I would assume that a big part of your sexuality and how you identify as to like whether you're a man or a woman or you're gay or you're straight, whatever, a lot of that has to do with your ability to sexually connect with somebody else, right? Like I'm straight because I want to sexually connect with men or whatever the example is. Yeah. But when you do these transitions, a lot of the times I was talking to a couple of people because I've done a couple gender episodes and I'm still dizzy about it, but the chances of you not being able to perform sexually, I mean, that goes up a lot. Like I wish I had the statistic in my head, but it was definitely over 50%. Like there's a good chance you can never get an erection or you can never have an orgasm. So what is the point of doing that surgery? how is that going to make you happy or fulfilled or lead a healthy life?
Yeah.
I don't know. And to make that decision when you're 10 is absurd. Absurd.
Yeah, you're not making that decision at 10.
No, your parent.
Like, you can't actually make that decision. Like informed consent, you can't do that. The UK, through their Keira Bell case, ruled that children are not capable of making such a profound decision on their life. The America society, but you know what? People, hormones are being advertised on my channel now. There's a huge industry. It's trillions of dollars for this lifelong medicalization. And that is something that needs to be brought up. We need to have conversations. I've tried to do, I could do more work on this, but with actual trans people and detransitioners and parents and husbands and wives and all that stuff to really just map out the territory, because the activist lens collapses everything into my way or death. Give me hormones or give me death, which is just the worst, most irresponsible way of guiding our society towards a future.
Have you had Buck on your podcast?
Yeah. Have you?
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah. He's a great guest.
Great.
Yeah, really great guest. Yeah, he was saying, like, if I ever took my kid to a doctor and they were saying give them hormones or they're gonna kill themselves, he's like, I would get my kid out of there so fast, and then I would sue that doctor. I was like, how are more parents not having that mindset? So with the advertising, do you know if that's showing up if the viewer is, because you know how you can tick like kids YouTube or whatever?
Okay, so
does that still show up?
I don't do kids YouTube. If you do kids YouTube, you don't get any comments, and plus my content is not for kids. So I'm being honest, but I'm also allowing more interactivity. But what those ads, I'm not putting those ads there. That's algorithmically generated. Right. So that is some algorithm watching somebody looking at a lot of gender and transition videos and saying, okay, maybe you would like this product. So that's just how it works. But that these products are being sold on YouTube. So you can watch all these videos, and this is what happens with a lot of the detransitioners. A lot of transitioners do. Very young, they just start watching all these videos about these really charismatic people talking about their depression, talking about their not fitting into society, how this is the solution. And then they have these ads like, inject this now, inject this now, inject this now. It's just like, it's really screwed up.
And you know what's really scary is when you're watching things for a long period of time, your brain goes into a theta state, like a high theta state. And when you're in that state, it's a lot harder to filter. Malleable? Yeah. Okay. And it's a lot harder to filter bullshit from facts. So you are a lot, like you said, more malleable and more susceptible to advertising. That's reckless.
Do you? Okay. This is the dicey turn in the conversation.
Oh boy.
Okay, if you're doing these conversations that last an hour, maybe 2 hours, maybe you're going to Rogan it and do a 3.5 hour
That's
session.
My goal.
So you get into the audience, probably most of the audience goes away, but you have like a good 100 people listening through the whole thing. So with your knowledge that they're in a theta state, right? They're relaxed, they're malleable, they're just purely ingesting, probably their body's engaged in something else. They're kind of in the state that we're in right now. We're in a really relaxed, I feel like we're really relaxed. We're just kind of going back and forth. What is your responsibility toward those individuals that are in that state? What would you like to give them? What is important for you to give them? Or like, if you're aware of that, what are you going to intend to do with that knowledge and then that power that you're having?
My goal is to always just share what are facts, what is my opinion, not to muddy those waters, because I think a lot of people will try to say like their opinion is fact, and I think that's irresponsible.
So ethic toward data.
Right. Towards just being honest upfront about like what's my opinion and what is the data as of today. And then for me, I would say like my mission statement of the podcast is to just create more curiosity in people, right? So like have people ask questions and not just say, this talking head told me this, so I have to take it as truth or to agree or whatever it is, go along with. And then also to show the humanity behind people, especially people that we disagree with. So for me, like, I'm obviously what's considered a controversial person. Shocker. So to show like my humanity, if I have other guests on, like I had Wayne Dupree on, and Aubrey Huff, both which were pretty controversial guests. I didn't really know that, but to show their human side and to get you to, I guess, maybe question fundamentally held beliefs that maybe aren't yours, right? So to pick apart what's your programming and where your core beliefs, like where's that authentic self, and then just get people to more of a love vibration. So all good stuff.
Yeah. I dovetail. I think everything that I'm doing is aligned with that. I like the what you were talking about, that pyramid, peace and love and joy, and alternating between those. Not love too heavy, but like that community, that bond is always possible. That connection, I guess, and then that love in the sense of the admiration of that human being that we're witnessing together, that we're experiencing together. And then the joy is like, that would be the thing. Like if I have an aspiration, like being able to provide that to the world would be amazing.
That's a beautiful aspiration. I'm actually reading the book Joy right now. It's with the Dalai Lama and the Arch. Oh, you've read it?
No, I don't know. I'm just in the joy stance now.
Oh, you're like, okay, I'm going to take it in.
Joy.
So far it's really good. I would highly recommend it. So it's with the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop. I can't remember.
Oh, really?
I'm so sorry. But yeah, you should check that one out. That's so far so good.
It's just joy. Then, is there any tidbits of that?
It's kind of it's explaining that the difference between like joy and happiness, like happiness is usually based on external factors, where joy is more of an internal state. And it's kind of what we were saying earlier on in the podcast, which is your inner state kind of creates your reality. Yeah. So to be in a joyful state is like better for you, better for everybody else. And that it's not dependent on anything else. It's dependent on yourself. Yeah. So that one's really good. And then Letting Go by David Hawkins is really good. So he talks a lot about the hierarchy of emotions and like their vibrational state. And
I've never heard of David. Have you had him on?
No, I would love to. He wrote Power versus Force.
Power versus Horses?
Force.
Oh, Force. Okay.
You had to have read that. I feel like everyone read that book back in the day. It was super, super popular. Yeah, his work is really, really great. Changed the way I look at a lot of things.
I'll look into them. See, the thing about being a podcaster is you talk to the authors. So you can like read just half their book, get a sense of it, and then have them just tell you the book. It's like
I know, that's
direct audio book right into your brain.
I know, and then like having them be able to break it down further is so wonderful. So he's on my list, but I feel like he's out of my league right now.
Yeah, yeah. You never know though. I just shoot out things. I mean, yeah, I shouldn't say this, but I'm trying to get Peterson on. I think
you can do it.
I think he
reposted you though today.
Yeah, he did. He did repost me, and I keep on dreaming about him. So I know that the eye of Peterson is like brushing across me. So.
And I think it's so cool. I never would have guessed that you were like so into like spirituality or religion or vibrations when you say stuff like that. Yeah, I'm like, that's really awesome.
I really appreciate us getting into that, and I keep that off my channel, except for live streams, just because of the way that it is for me, and the way that my audience is formed. But I've been doing a lot of podcast interviews where this has come up, and I've just been allowing that side of myself to shine, or not shine, probably throb or subtly pulse.
No, I love it though. Yeah, because looking at your channel, I never would have guessed, because it's just a lot more serious, I think, and yeah,
analytical.
I like seeing that side. Was that something that you just like worked on as like an adult later on, or I know you said your dad's a pastor. Are you more traditional?
Oh, are you talking about my spirituality?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just been a reality in my life that I could never stray too far away from. That's the guiding principle of, it's always been the guiding principle of my reality. I mean, since I had very, very strong spiritual experiences as a kid that showed me the reality behind or underneath my life. And then when I strayed from that, growing up and kind of getting disillusioned with things, like I went on a search for that. And now I go through this getting closer to that and going away from that, getting closer to that and going away. Next month, I'm going to kind of slow down my life and kind of give up alcohol for a while. I drink too much. And kind of do a version of Ramadan to kind of clean house and get back to that Benjamin, core Benjamin thing, So it's important for me. It helps me a lot.
Yeah, I feel like you get almost like a cheat code when you're finally in tune with spirituality. You get those dreams, like you said, like you can feel the eye of Peterson, and then all of a sudden he's retweeting you. I think you get more of those serendipitous moments when you do focus on your spirituality and that part of your life. It's when things start happening for you.
I was listening to a talk by the founder of Subud this weekend, and he was talking about that, where when you are in tune with power of God is the word that I use, but we could use whatever you want. When you are close to that, and that is something that's infused, you get insights. And I was just thinking about that, like, to what degree can I perfect my interview by really being attuned to that, and then really just I every once in a while I just know the right thing to ask, or I know the right thing to say, and you can feel us go to a different level. And I think it really does. It's based on me exploring and maintaining an awareness at that level of myself, and then I can actually really pay attention to the other person. And I noticed that in you. I noticed that in the way that you handled this conversation. Like, you're providing the ground for conversation, because the way that the quality of your attention is allowing this to take shape on a different level than other people. Super smart people are really difficult to keep up with, but I'm not super smart like James Lindsay or Wokel. They're like, whoa, like, okay, maybe that's the question.
No, I don't know. I would put you on the same level as James for sure. Yeah, I was just as I guess nervous with my performance with you as I was with James.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know what we were talking about. No, I think we did like 2 interviews this time. Like we did my interview and your interview. They kind of fit together in this one. I didn't know what to talk to you about. Now I know what to talk to you about.
Well, I think that's
our connection.
I think that's the confusing thing when you have someone that has their own podcast. It's to try to figure out what to talk to them about, because when you have a channel like yours, you hit so many topics, and it's hard to find you, right? Like, where's Benjamin? Because you know what I mean? Because as a good host, you obviously want to provide a platform for your guests to be able to share, because I'm here to like learn from you, and then add my little tidbits as we go along. It's like not about me. So I think that's what makes like a good host, and you do that a lot too, where you let your guests do their thing and then you chime in when you need to. But yeah, like I was definitely nervous because you're this intellect. And I think for me,
just finding like this brain in this jar with like some photons.
Yeah, I mean that as a compliment. But for me, I'm obviously still fine tuning it because I'm, not even a year in, but being able to just focus on where you're going and then just where my genuine curiosity is and just go there, because I've tried the whole format of like making a list and making a note. Like I have a notepad in front of me that like I almost journal before each one just to like let my mind go. But anytime I've ever like looked and say, okay, well, what about this? It's just so dull and there's no life there. It's too constricted.
Yeah. Every once in a while, I feel like I should have had a question. But whenever I set up an interview and then people are like, well, what are we going to talk about? I usually say, okay, your life and then your expertise. Right? I want to know who you are. And then here's a couple topics that I'm curious about. And then usually they completely forget. And then they just kind of go off and we just go on an adventure. Like, where are we going to go? I'll follow you. Oh, what's over there? What does that mean? What's dangling from that tree? And you just
but that's how you get I guess, deeper conversations. And then you can also have repeat guests because, so with Deborah, for example, she talks about her book a ton, obviously. Like that's mostly what she's doing on her press runs and when she's doing all of these guest podcasts. When I had her on a second time, we just went somewhere totally different. And we were just talking about like sex and paraphilias and all like any kind of abnormalities. And it was just like a free for all. And everyone loved it because they're like, man, I don't really get to see this unbridled version of her. And I think when you can do that with a guest, it's such a beautiful thing. And then they're more authentic instead of asking you a question that you've probably been asked 1,000 times, right? It's like, well, let's just see where we naturally end up together. It's a lot more fun
every once in a while, I'll land a guest who's popular, and then they'll get the Benjamin treatment. And then I get the comments, the response like, oh, I get to see this other side of this person, because I don't adhere to that level, which is the marketing level or or even like the intellectual discourse level, where people are kind of having the same conversations over and over and over again. I'm like, well, who are you? I mean, with me and James and Lindsay, James, Lindsay, and Wokel, we're getting in. We do. I do like the regular guests because then you start to get a better pattern on each other, and then some people like learn how to listen to you or learn. You kind of craft something like that, and then you get more comfortable and you can get totally deeper. So when you find those people that you sync up with, definitely have them on again. And then you get to kind of do a series. I like to meet up with people, like some people like once a year and check in, like, where are you now? Like with the detransitioner girls, especially because they're so young and every year is such a big leap for them, and then other people like that. Then you get to kind of provide like this archival document on these people over time, which we lose a lot of. Like with part of the flaw of cancel culture is that it compacts time and humanity into something that doesn't change over time. And I think that mentality is because we don't witness these people we're attacking as living over time and developing and changing and moving from one idea to another, and to model that for people, I think is a valuable thing.
Oh yeah, there's, like I said earlier, there's no room for forgiveness or grace or growth. And there was this quote, and it's like, if you're not totally embarrassed about who you were last year, you're not doing enough work. And for me, that's so true. Like even in shorter periods of time, I'm like, man, I can't believe that was my headspace, right? Like I'm totally different. Like I was supposed to have Johan Hari on last week, but it just didn't work out. He wrote Lost Connections. He's very difficult to nail. I thought I had him, and then it didn't pan out. But he totally changed my beliefs, like radical 180. And there's few times in my life where there's been such a stark difference, like an aha moment. I had a cop dad, so drugs were bad, right? Drugs were always bad, and the way America's fighting the quote unquote drug war is the way to go, and Mexico's this awful place that is just trying to push drugs through our border, yada yada. I didn't have a lot of sympathy for addicts. I was kind of like, you made your bed and just stop, right? Like just stop was my belief. And then after listening to him and reading his book and, watching his interviews and all of that, 180. Like now I'm like, all drugs should be decriminalized, and, we should have these centers where you're giving out heroin to people, like crazy things that I was like, those people are madmen and they just want to ruin the youth of America. That's what I believed. But after spending time with him through his work, it completely changed my mind. So you could go back in time and probably find, pieces of me where I'm criticizing addiction or these hard drugs or the legalization, or I should say decriminalization of all drugs. Who just did that? Was it Washington?
Oregon.
State? Oregon.
Yeah.
Okay, like Oregon. When they initially did that, I was like, what the fuck are they doing? I thought it was the worst idea on the planet. But then I listened to him and all of the data that he was displaying. And I was like, well, you can't argue with that. So,
well, as long as you do the other end and take care of all the addicts and provide recovery for them, that's the part where it fails, where people don't, the state doesn't set up the institutions for, helping people that get hooked on that,
Okay. Yeah. So I haven't seen what they're doing, but he was talking specifically about like Switzerland, and who else was it?
Well, when you use European countries as the model, those are really deep cultures. So you're talking about a specific culture, and America's its own culture. And even within America, there's so many different cultures. So there's not that unifying culture. But I can't get too deep into that argument, but I'm always kind of like, we're not like Europe, any given country. Something else is going to happen. And we don't have that connectivity. We're very scattered. We're very independent. We're very atomized in our culture. And so I don't know if that lends to us taking care. It's one thing to take the lid off the problem, but you still have the problem, which is ultimately human nature. But human nature is to be lazy and just like let the problem fester.
Oh, totally. But I definitely think we should try to implement what they were doing over in Switzerland, and maybe someplace small, and just keep a super eye and see what happens. But if that's a subject you're curious about, I definitely recommend checking out that book, because I don't know. This is like a recent
that's a whole
switch for me.
That's a whole conversation. So I need to learn more. So we'll see what happens in Portland. But I know from on the street, it's like immediately, it's just like, okay, now we have even more heroin, homeless encampments going on. So, but Portland's got so many different problems.
So it's not
and I still can't get mail order LSD. I can get all the estrogen I want, but I can't get a single tab of acid. What's up with that?
Yeah, that I always wonder where people are getting like all of those crazy drugs. Like when Rogan talks about doing like DMT, I was like, where is he getting that?
Well, he's connected.
I'm sure. I'm like, I want to explore that. But I'm terrified. Again, cop daughter, so it's like deeply embedded in my like subconscious that if I do anything, I'm gonna die. It's like when the first time I smoked weed, I was 19, and I was convinced that I was gonna die, like overdose on weed. So I was so ignorant to it. So I was super paranoid. It was a really bad first experience. But
it can be pretty harrowing.
Yeah, it's a lot. But I'm actually supposed to be doing my first psilocybin experience. Like next month is the goal.
Really?
I'm really nervous. I'm doing a lot of prep work prior to that to make sure that I have like the best experience possible and don't completely lose my mind and just cry and sob for 6 hours. But yeah, we're doing like a little mini girls retreat with this shaman, and we're just gonna go see what we can find. I'm really excited, but I'm also equally nervous. So yeah, I've made giant strides in my belief system in that category. So do you want to tell the listeners like where they can follow you, support you, like plug away? Okay.
This is Benjamin Boyce, and my podcast is Boyce of Reason. It's found on all the various podcast platforms. My YouTube channel is Benjamin A. Boyce. I do a lot of interviews. I have this really intense documentary and a lot of just talking head stuff. The best way to support me is just check me out. Also, I'm on Twitter if you like my sentences. I was very spicy today. We didn't get into that, but maybe we will in the future. And that's at Benjamin A. Boyce as well. Thanks for having me on, Candice.
Of course, and thank you for giving me so much of your time. I seriously appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You can also share this podcast with a friend. It helps my podcast grow, and I really appreciate it. I hope to see you next week.